About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he could not find a scientific explanation for. So with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness studies, along with cybernetics and anthropology and metaphysics, and through this series of programs I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer any questions that you may send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. That's Noetic moments.org. So in medicine and psychology, if you ask someone about consciousness, they'll define it as being awake and aware, knowing what's going on around us. You've seen that in the paramedics, checking your date, whether you know what date it is. You've seen that when paramedics are checking to know. You've seen that when paramedics check to see if you know what date it is, what your name is, and so on. In the field of noetics, though, consciousness is so much more. Not only is it the processes and products of mind that we're aware of, it's also those we're not aware of. And it's those profound human experiences that can shape our lives. Ultimately, though, the research in noetics is demonstrating that consciousness is what connects us all. So far in this series, we've looked at a number of models of what consciousness is. We started with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung with their early explorations of what might be going on outside of our awareness, what is in fact unconscious, and Jung's notion that there might be a field of human consciousness surrounding us. By the 1960s, Charles Tart was describing various states of consciousness, and Julian Jaynes was relating consciousness to the separation of the right and left hemispheres of our brain. We looked at some of the field models that emerged during that time, developed by Kurt Levine, Rupert Sheldrake, and others, to try to explain how it is that mind affects and is affected by the body and other things faster than nerve signals can travel. Which brought up how quantum mechanics relates to consciousness, as described in the work of David Bohm, Dana Zohar, and Amit Goswami, among others. We then looked at the global brain, or noosphere, as described by Peter Russell, Teilhard de Chardin, and Ervin Laszlo. Then the field of transpersonal psychology, which applies these ideas and understandings in therapy and research. We then came back to the body and looked at the work of Bruce Lipton and Candace Pert, who described how hormones generated in the brain act as molecules of emotion through the body and lead to a biology based on our belief. And that led to what is increasingly called the state of coherence, a state of consciousness in which the heart, the mind, and the emotions are all in alignment so that belief and action are fully aligned. We've explored some of the experimental results supporting these new ideas about consciousness, some demonstrations of telepathic communication between two people, of mind affecting matter, and the experience of remote viewing or clairvoyance. Then we talked about different states of consciousness that we operate in every day, exploring frequencies and how we can move into higher and lower frequencies of vibration patterns in the brain and the heart, using the work of Penny Pierce, the study of cymatics, David Hawkins, and the water crystal experiments of Masaru Emoto, and more. For several episodes, then, we looked at the healing process, knowing everything that we'd explored so far, and we looked at the role that consciousness and what we think of as energy flows play in the body's response to threats and distress. Then we looked at the structure and function of the brain, which we saw is the bridge between the mind, that field, and the body, even though materialist and physicalist scientists think the brain is the origin of consciousness. But that idea that mind and brain are separate leads us to explore how the mind, since it's not a function of the brain, continues, even though the brain may not be functioning at all, when the brain and heart have flatlined and the person is declared dead. And we got to see the results of a number of experiments around that subject. To explain it more fully, we looked again at Ervin Laszlo's global mind, which he also calls the Akash, as in Akashic record, the Hindu idea that everything that ever was is stored in the fabric of the universe. And we looked at a physicist's remarkable discovery that equations that describe a neural network in a machine, as in computer, as a system, also demonstrate the behaviors of quantum reality when the system is in balance, and of our classical reality when the system is far from equilibrium. This has profound implications for the nature of that very field that Ervin Laszlo talked about. And then we return to how bodies can heal simply by a shift in the consciousness of the individual. That is, a shift in their capacity to experience what is stored in their own mind and in the larger mind that we're calling the Akash, or global mind, through the shifts in their beliefs and actions and through their reliance on the others around them. Last time, in episode 39, we listened to Rupert Sheldrake explain how it is that the fields we've been talking about work and how they affect our experience. You can catch up on those past shows on the KXCR.net archives. If you don't see it on the screen, click on that little cloud up on the banner at the top of the screen. And on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the video clips, the books, and the authors that I mention and use on the show. What I thought I'd do today is take another concept we've touched on a little deeper. This is the idea of vibration and frequency. In particular, we're going to look at sound and its effects on the brain and body. Now, we've talked about how the audio receptors in the brain are located on either side, near, not surprisingly, the ears. Here's a clip explaining how hearing works.
The shape of your outer ear is as unique as your fingerprints, but plays an important role in how you hear. Called the pinna, its funnel-like shape and curves enable you to determine where a sound is coming from, so you immediately know if the source is in front, behind, above, or below you. Sound waves are collected by the outer ear and directed along the ear canal to the eardrum. When the sound waves hit the eardrum, they cause the 3 bones of the middle ear to move. The smallest of these bones, the stirrup, fits into the oval window between the middle and inner ear. When the oval window moves, fluid in the inner ear moves, carrying the energy through a delicate snail-shaped structure called the cochlea. In the inner ear, thousands of microscopic hair cells are bent by the movement of the fluid inside the cochlea. When these hairs bend, it sets off nerve impulses which are passed by the auditory nerve to the hearing center of the brain. Sounds like words, music, or laughter are translated from these impulses by the brain.
So sound, as vibrations in the air, are received by that odd shape we call an ear, which determines where they come from, and then travel down the ear tubes into the ear proper, the inner ear, where these little tiny hairs affect nerve cells, which then are sent to a receiving system in the brain. And that receiving system then interprets the sounds. Now, a number of sounds are ignored. If, for example, you have an air conditioner, a furnace, or a refrigerator that regularly goes on and off with a low-level sound, you probably are not hearing it after the first day or two. If, on the other hand, someone out there is squealing their brakes or roaring an engine, or if you're tuned to hear babies cry, the brain immediately picks up on those sounds to tell you what you have told yourself is important to you. Now, it's possible, through mindfulness, to train the brain to hear everything. In fact, it's possible by practice to train the brain to hear not only everything that you normally hear, but to begin to hear things that you haven't heard in the past, much smaller, lower frequency, or more quiet sounds that you've ignored because they didn't seem to be relevant or important to your daily life. Sound is an amazing thing, and this brain of ours is so marvelously structured that whatever we tell it to receive, it receives. And whatever we tell it to interpret things as, it interprets as. For example, when I was a young mom, if I was in the shower, sometimes the sound of the shower itself would generate a pattern that my brain interpreted as a baby crying, and I would leap out of the shower to find the baby happily sound asleep. I'm sure you have a similar story. So sound and hearing are connected, but they aren't necessarily the same thing. Now, a lot of scientists have been exploring not just sound, but music, and the effects that music have on the brain and on the mind. So I'm going to let you listen to some of the experimenters and some of their results. Here's a music therapist talking about her ideas.
Well, research has shown that professional musicians actually have a more clear, less noisy signal, vocal signal or instrumental signal, than non-musicians. And music therapists are professional musicians. They are highly trained professional musicians that are often trained on many, many instruments and on the voice. And so when music therapists try to change behavior and they provide instructions, those instructions are embedded in a clearer signal, a less noisy signal, and potentially easier for the brain to understand. One of the major principles of neuroscience is called the Hebbian principle, and it states that neurons that fire together wire together. Or I like to say, neurons out of sync do not link, right? So what does this mean? Remember I said in order to learn something new, you have to have two neurons, and they have to make a connection. Well, in order to make that connection, they must send a signal at the same time. They must fire synchronously. Once they do, and they do that repeatedly, they make a new connection. So what's unique about music and music therapy is that rhythm synchronizes neural activity. So as music therapists, one of the key elements that we do is we pair information with rhythm. We present information through rhythm, non-music information, with the rhythm, so that we are, again, synchronizing the neural connectivity or neural activity so we can make new connections in that brain. The final principle that I think is probably the most important is that music can activate the entire brain. You know that you can read music, that's one part of the brain. You can listen to music, that's another part of the brain. You have memories that are associated with music, yet another part of the brain. We can move to music, another part of the brain, and emotional response to music, another part of the brain. Music therapists are highly trained to manipulate the music to generate a specific behavior, right? And that specific behavior has to be controlled by a specific area in the brain. Music therapy uses a clear signal, like music, to transmit information. Music therapy uses rhythm to synchronize neural firing, and it can engage multiple areas of the brain. So music therapy is really, really good for the brain. And so then how do I use this theory to explain what I do with people with Parkinson's disease? This is a gentleman with Parkinson's disease, and he has difficulty walking, and often he freezes when he's in crowded environments. Yeah, try to go around that way. And in this case, he's walking in time with the live music.
I dreamt I held you in my arms, and I awoke, dear.
And you know, I can't go with him everywhere he goes and sing to him, but he can sing in his head. Pretty amazing, right? He went from not being able to walk at all to being able to walk with music, and then eventually being able to walk on his own with music in his head.
That was a little unfair because she was showing a video of a man having difficulty walking and then walking very smoothly when she was singing, and walking as smoothly when he was imagining hearing the song. So the audio receptors in the brain were sending the same signal to the premotor part of the brain that was telling him how to walk, whether he heard it or not, whether he imagined it or whether he heard it. And this is something that we're learning more and more about the brain, is what we imagine and what we actually sense are not distinguishable to the nerve cells in the various cognitive and motor activity parts of the brain. Music, whether we are hearing it or whether we are imagining it, is an effective device for shifting our experience from whatever isn't working to a rhythm and a mode that can work for us. But it turns out that music and sound can do even more.
Although there are millions of neurons, they're not just randomly firing unconnected. What we know is that neurons that fire together wire together. And so we have circuits within our brain. So for example, the motor circuit is multiple parts of the brain that need to connect so that you can initiate a movement, so you can control that movement and stop that movement. The memory circuit, again, connects multiple parts of the brain so that what you're experiencing now, you may actually be able to remember tomorrow as the present experience, perception, turns into short-term memory and into long-term memory. What else we know about the brain is that healthy circuits that are functioning for you now require steady brain waves. In other words, if one part of the brain is going like this and the other part occasionally like that, they're not going to connect. The circuit will not work. And what we know is that the frequency at which neurons like to connect and respond most easily is around 40 hertz. When circuits do not function correctly, bad things happen. For example, when the parts of the brain that are supposed to initiate and control movement do not connect, you may not be able to initiate a movement as in dyskinesia, or you may not be able to stop as in a tremor. So you may have Parkinson's. when parts that are supposed to give you a long-term memory do not connect, you may have dementia or Alzheimer's. So let me talk about a case of Alzheimer's that we treated. She had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's about 6 months before she came to our experimental vibroacoustic low-frequency 40 hertz treatment. And so we gave her a prescription of 30 minutes of 40 hertz sound stimulation 3 times a week for 4 weeks. And we used this chair, the Next Wave chair that had speakers built into it, 6 speakers, so that that low frequency 40 hertz sound you heard, you would actually feel as vibration. At the end of the 12 weeks, we realized that her test score had gone up. She was giving us indication that she could remember her grandchildren's names more easily. She seemed more cognitively engaged and clearer. And why would this happen in the case of Alzheimer's? So one of the things we know about Alzheimer's is that as a person develops this, there seem to be fewer neurons firing together at the 40 hertz level. So there's less power in 40 hertz. That means the circuits are decaying. We also know, of course, that sound stimulation increases 40 hertz firing, and so we can increase the number of neurons firing at 40 hertz and hopefully restore those circuits.
Okay, so now we have frequency, and we have tone, and we have neurons that fire together, wire together. What these folks are telling us is that when we are listening to certain kinds of sounds, certain kinds of vibratory patterns, the brain aligns on those vibratory patterns. If there is not a pattern, they can't do that. If the sounds that are entering the brain are not following a rhythmic sequence, if the vibration patterns that are entering the brain are not in a range that the neurons can follow, then the brain basically gets scrambled because the neurons are not wiring together. What that means then is the brain no longer has access as the receiver transmitter that it is to the wisdom, the information, the understanding, the fundamental knowing that is our essential being, our mind. And if the brain doesn't have access to that, then what it feeds into the body and to the world around us is going to be scrambled. It's going to be a mixture of signals. It's going to be signals that are not in that coherent state we talked about weeks ago, where brain and body, emotions and mind are all in alignment. They can't be without some kind of consistent vibration pattern. So let me share one more clip with you to help you understand that more fully.
I always feel so much better and energetic and energized when I sing a song or play in a band. And those of you out there who've sung in choirs or play a musical instrument, I'm sure can identify with that feeling. You get a kind of rewarding, even addictive response. And when you hear music that you like, you want to move. You want to maybe get up and dance. Music also affects us at the biological level. Internally, it can affect blood pressure, heart rate, hormones. It can affect us, give us goosebumps or spine-tingling chills. Now, as far as we know, all groups of people around the world make, appreciate, and respond to music. It is a universal human skill. Music activates regions in the front part of the cortex that are also activated when you perform cooperative altruistic acts. These are acts where you put somebody else's welfare in front of your own, sometimes at a risk or cost to yourself. When you are listening to a piece that you're familiar with, there's often an emotional peak in that music, and you're expecting it, you're anticipating it. A group in Montreal showed that during that anticipation phase, when you're expecting this emotional peak, there's a release of this neurotransmitter called dopamine in a certain part of the brain. Now, what is particularly interesting is that the levels of a hormone called oxytocin in the bloodstream are raised when people are singing together, but particularly when singers are improvising together. Now, I find that interesting because oxytocin is a hormone that's well known to be associated with empathy, trust, and relationship building. Our sensitivity to pain is also decreased when we're involved in group music-making activities, as are levels of the stress hormone cortisol.
Well-being, a function of music. Isn't that cool? That sound tells us that it's time to shift gears. If you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments on KXCR 90.7 on the FM dial and streaming on KXCR.net. The book we're looking at today is called Tuning the Human Biofield by Eileen Day McCusick, and the subtitle is Healing with Vibrational Sound Therapy. The book has a number of people saying it's good stuff, which is useful to know, and it's put out by Healing Arts Press in Vermont. It was originally published back in 2014. Now, you may recall the use of that term biofield a while back. The National Institutes of Health in the U.S. accepted the human biofield as a term when they started receiving and being able to review a number of pretty effective papers suggesting what we've been suggesting here, that there is some kind of energetic field surrounding the body, that the vibrations of the heart and the brain affect various organs' vibrations, and the whole neural system vibrations seem to have combined to form this field. So the human biofield. Eileen McCusick came to find that she could use normal sound, hearable sound. Now, we talked about how sound and music affect the brain. Well, it turns out the neurons in the brain are not the only neurons in the body. And all these neurons are affected. The rhythm of their connections are affected by the vibrations of sound around us. What Elizabeth is talking about is using tuning forks to adjust to the frequency of each of the energy centers, the neuron clusters in the body. In the Hindu tradition, we call those chakras. You may be familiar with using crystal bowls or metal bowls and the vibration and the frequency associated with those being associated with specific frequencies in specific chakras. So through this book, she's providing case studies and testimonials from her students and a table of the chakras and all kinds of really good things. So I think you will find this very interesting if you're interested in ways to look at how frequency and the neuron system in the body as well as the brain are interconnected. Tuning the Human Biofield, Healing with Vibrational Sound by Elizabeth Day McCusick. And again, that is published by Healing Arts Press in Rochester, Vermont. Well, we are out of time for today. The next time we get together, we'll look more at some of the research that's being done in an attempt to understand what consciousness is, what it really does, and how we can experience life differently when we understand and use it fully. You can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there is a list of the shows and the links associated with each show, along with archived shows from past months. And you can also use the form to send me your comments and questions, which I'll do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments at KXCR Community Radio, 90.7 FM in Florence, Oregon. And have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.